All right. Well, thank you for coming along. I know I'm no Dr. Ricciardo, who is currently in Sicily and boiling to death, he tells me. Because it's even, I mean, Sicily already is normally 100 degrees. It's now apparently 110 or 115 or something. So it's a nightmare, and I'm so glad I'm not there. And Francesca, I think, because my understanding from Sal was that you guys had sort of done double duty on chapter 2. So in fact, you were only on chapter 3 at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Did that make sense to you, Francesca?
At the last meeting that I was at, I think we started on chapter 3, and then we were going to continue at the meeting on July 4th. But then I wasn't at that meeting, so I don't know how far you guys got or what you discussed then.
That was a day off.
That was a day off.
Right.
Yeah. They were in fact having, yes, at least Nana was having burgers at our house on July 4th. So, yeah. Okay. So Francesca, you sort of took a look at chapter 3, is that correct?
Yeah, chapter 3, I think that's around where we were. We were talking about strange attractors and state space, phase shifts, and that area of it.
Okay, so why don't you get us started, Francesca, and I'll, just get us going, and we'll take it up from there.
Okay. Well, one thing that I thought was interesting was they were talking about simplicity emerging from complexity, like with ant colonies was an example that they used. I thought that was interesting how with a complex system, there's all these complex components and things, but that it has this emergent simplicity. You know what I mean? I think that was on page 60. They were talking about that. Yeah, the variables. Yeah, I just thought that was interesting. But how that works, I don't know. Let me go ahead and look at my text. See. And then we were talking about self-organization, and self-similarity. I thought that was also really interesting. The fractals, I think we talked about that some last time.
Yeah, I know Sal's interested in fractals.
The fractalism and the self-similarity of the different aspects in the complex systems. How there's self-similarity. It just made me think about like the concept of like universal consciousness or interconnectedness, like different aspects all being similar at different levels. Do you know what I mean? We're talking about that in there. On I think page 63. Take a look at my text. Yeah. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I see that Sal has a couple of notes before that you guys might have looked at before. On page 47, did you talk about this before? The state space of the system is the set of possible states.
I think we started talking about that. Yeah, on page 47 and 48, we were talking about those diagrams and.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. That they did using the traffic lights. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were talking about the attractors.
Yes, he has another note about the attractors. 3 types of attractions: fixed point, cyclical, closed loop, and chaotic attractors. Do you remember talking about that?
Yeah, I think we talked about that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about Edge of Chaos a little bit, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Phase shift. Origins.
So where was your ant behavior?
I think that was on page 60.
So is that the self-organization and emergence? I was just looking at this self-organization and emergence because I ride a horse. And so I was looking at the way that it uses the metaphor of horse riding.
Yeah, we were talking about that, the way that the attractors and the different states that the horse is run in, I guess.
Yeah.
Let me look at my book. Yeah, we were talking about the different gaits of the horse, I believe.
Right.
Canter.
I guess what I find really interesting in this is the way that they sort of bring all the sort of big things together, right? So you can talk about, I don't know, ant colonies or horse and rider, or these concepts of self-organizations and emergence, like as one thing. But then, and I confess at this point, I haven't read anywhere near as much as I should have done. Do they actually relate it already to language or not?
45.
Or 45? Ah, your horse example is 45. Right. I mean, do they talk about it in each chapter as about language, or do they just sort of, are they going to wait and make?
haven't gone into it so much, but in chapter 4, I think they start relating it to language more. But yeah, so far they haven't done much relating.
Right. Yes, okay, so these, sorry, Francesca, I'm back on 45, looking at the horse and the rider. As a example of a complex dynamic system, yeah, that's true. Interesting. Okay. What else did you have for us, Francesca?
Well, they were also talking about, let's see, they were talking about the co-evolution and co-adaptation. So systems evolving in reaction to each other. So one of their examples was language teaching and language assessment. Those systems co-evolving.
Dude, where was that?
That's
Yes, right. 66, 67. Interesting.
yeah, the way those have evolved with each other. Let me take a look at my book real quick. Oh yeah, they were talking about English in particular in like China and Korea. People wanting to teach English to their children younger and younger, and the way that people react to that, and the co-evolution of the teaching system with what people are looking for, I guess.
So have you heard this term washback before, guys, on page 67?
Yeah, I think we talked about that in the TESOL classes, didn't we?
Yeah. Yeah. Done anyway. Do you remember what it is?
Does it have to do with like feedback, kind of, I guess? Can't remember.
No, it's the effect that the choice of assessment has on the way that you learn. So for both the teacher and the student. So a good example would have been the old-fashioned TOEFL test, which none of you probably remember. but that I used to teach, and it tested your ability to do teeny tiny grammatical things. So within the sentence. So there was no discourse level examination or discussion or anything. It literally tested whether you knew that certain prepositions should have been in versus on or something else. So, and the washback from that was that, right? Because it meant that all our books and all our materials and teaching was focused on teeny tiny little bits of grammar rather than on sort of being able to use the language or understand concepts in discourse and so on, because we knew that that's what they were going to be tested on. Now the new TOEFL 2000 doesn't do that anymore. And of course there was also no speaking or writing, speaking or listening either in the old TOEFL. So that was another thing they changed in the TOEFL 2000. So now your washback, the idea of the TOEFL 2000 was to have a much more productive washback, meaning that based on the questions that they asked you to do, the teaching had to incorporate more effective language instruction, including listening, speaking, and so on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, whether it's actually done that or not is another, issue. But the reason she says in here, washback is often seen as negative and dubious, as for example, when students spend excessive amounts of time training students to techniques to pass an examination. That's what we used to do with the TOEFL. That was really negative washback. What she's saying is, there can be more positive washback than that.
And I think they were just going on talking about context. Mm-hmm. And then another thing I thought, they were talking about context, so they were talking about language is developed in and applied in context and is adapted for context.
So this is on page 69.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're looking about the middle of the page, language is developed in context as use in context shapes language resources. Language is applied in context as context selects the language action to be performed. The language is adapted for context as the experience of past language use is fitted into the here and now. I have to say they do a really good job of sort of saying why language is a complex system.
Mm-hmm.
So then if we carry on that page, they do this summary. Complex systems are always changing, change smoothly or radically, and show self-organization through phase shifts that produce emergent behavioral phenomena on a higher level of organization. Complex systems in and near a tractor show stability and variability. Complex systems near the edge of chaos are very flexible and responsive. Systems in regions of their state space are extremely sensitive to small changes in the initial conditions. I suppose that's the idea of the butterfly in the hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
Some systems show criticality around phase transitions. Two or more complex systems can change in response to each other and can be described with collective variables. Wow. In the following chapters, we consider systems of central concern for applied linguists.
And then they talk a little bit more about the nature of research within this framework. So how research is going to have to be changed in order to research from this perspective. So how, for instance, with hypotheses, how we can't make predictions the same way as we could before, and so we have to sort of make amends for this in the system, and the way that the nature of data and evidence is going to change. I think they continue on 71 and then onwards talking about
Okay, that's super interesting. So that's on starting on 71, right, and then going over to, yeah. So what does this mean in terms of the best kinds of research approaches, right?
Right, yeah, starting to talk about the research approaches and how the nature of these things is going to change within complex systems research.
Yeah, right. Here's a developed.
Based on the fact that with making predictions in complex systems, there's so many factors at play that you won't necessarily know all of them. And so
Right.
that has to be taken into account, and all the things that we can't necessarily see or that aren't obvious.
Oh, I like that thing here. When a sand pile avalanches, theory and description is not about individual grains of sand, but the behavior of the system as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
We never know which particular grain of sand will produce the avalanche. So, yeah, so that's really sort of a critical issue for linguistics research, right, and language research. That maybe trying to pull out the independent, separate strands are actually not going to buy you as much. So taking an individual hypothesis and looking at one tiny thing is not going to buy you that much, because basically what you're doing is looking at an individual grain of sand, and that isn't going to tell you what the system does, right? Is that everybody else's understanding of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's awesome, actually. Reductionist explanations are not possible, right? Complex systems are not random, but they are non-linear, right? Oh, that's very interesting, and also incredibly scary. And it means a lot of the stuff that we do right now is completely meaningless or verging on the meaningless. That's hysterical in a really scary way.
And they didn't talk about it much in this chapter, but when I was doing my research paper for Bibliography and Methods of Research, which I did it on this topic, basically, they were talking about different methods of how we can do research. So one of the examples was action research, which I think that was where you do something to the system to see how the system responds, is a way to try to understand the system's behavior. I think that was what it was.
Is that in here, Francesca, or did you got that from somewhere else?
Let me see and pull it up. I think it is in here, but it may not be in this chapter. Let me look really quickly. I think I got that from a different source that was also by the same authors, but
Yeah. No, but that makes total sense, that's what you would have to do. You poke a stick at the system and see what happens, how it changes, and then you, is that what she said?
yeah, basically, let me take a look at my thing here. Action
that, Francesca, because that's also super interesting.
They introduce outside influences and components into a system, test the system's responses, and thereby build an understanding of the system and its behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they were. I had a note on it and I forgot. Oh yeah, testing its resistance to perturbations. Yeah, yeah, they do talk about it in this a little bit. Let me see if I can find the page.
Oh, it's just so interesting because it's really, if you look at page 73.
Oh yeah, 73, they talk about that on there.
Yeah, complex systems we want to understand and investigate movement between stability and flux. So, the stability of the system can be investigated by testing its resistance to perturbations. Pushing a learner's language to the edge of its capability can reveal the stability of structures and lexes. Sorry, I was just going to say the other issue is this variability in data is not noise, but is part of behavior of the system and to be expected around stabilities. Whereas we tend to want to, I mean, you know, the whole concept of statistical proof is to get rid of variability, right? And to norm everything out as much as humanly possible. So that's fun. Yeah, it's the very opposite kind of approach to the scientific model that we currently have.
Yeah, I think they start talking about that some in the next chapter, the idealization of previous linguistics research, idolizing, and we talked about that, I think, last time too, a little bit. Idealizing things so that we can sort of understand it better, and how that can be useful as well, so that we can actually try to understand these things, because it's so complex that it may be impossible to do it without sometimes making it like a cleaner.
So I think that that's generally speaking people's opinion of something like linguistic research, that the phenomena is so complicated. And the results, particularly if you look at something like second language learning, the results are so variable that we all recognize that there isn't a panacea. Thus, but we can't all deal with all of the things all of the time, right? So, because otherwise you get nothing done. So you have to break it down into pieces. You said that was chapter 4?
They start talking about that more in chapter 4, yeah. Let's see. Realization. Forgot to write down the page numbers. I can't find where it was. Let me see. They were talking about Chomsky. Oh, here I think, on page 89 in chapter 4, the influence of linguistics.
Ooh.
They start talking about that, and how with Chomsky and Saussure they were doing this sort of with that research, and linguists have been selective in the data that they chose to analyze and represent in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
And the segregation of the subsystems, removing the dimension of time. Oh, so they call it, I think they call it there, on 91, decontextualizing, segregating, and atemporalizing. Common enough in science, they say, and some would say necessary in order to cope with the complexity of what is being investigated.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so you have to put that though against the statement on page 90. Chomsky recognized that applied linguistics were fundamentally different many years ago, but failure to heed this has come at great cost to applied linguistics. And I think that's because if you look at a lot of the work in the 80s, particularly, we ended up testing stuff on the assumptions that theoretical stuff was meaningful. So, for example, the best example I can give is, how does this work? The way that not minimalism, principle and parameters that Chomskyan theory worked was that certain things presupposed other things. So if you, theoretically, so that if you learned, I don't know, I forget the exact example, but you learned that the adverb in, or the adjective in French goes after the noun, that also means that you learn other things at the same time. It was part of a parameter, right? And so you so just by learning one thing, other things could click into place. So a lot of people spent a lot of time testing to see if this was true. And for the most part, they failed dismally in language learning. And you think about it, it's because it's one step removed, right? It's begins from a theory that in and of itself didn't have, well, as we've now discovered, had a lot of flaws and a lot of problems. So if you start by taking that as God's gift and then try and test that, then you're now doubly far away from the phenomena itself, because you've now led yourself down a garden path, or you're now going further down the garden path, and which is what we did a lot of in the 80s.
I think they referenced that in the, I'm trying to find on my note. Where did they reference that?
Well, that'd be cool if they did.
Yeah, in chapter 3, they were talking about the importance of understanding the way that our previous assumptions are affecting. So yeah, they talked about that in chapter 3 as well.
Oh, cool.
How if you're building on something that's already not correct or not completely correct. Let me see where the.
Yes. So unfortunately, this has become a thing in a lot of applied linguistics research, that certain assumptions are taken for granted, and then other things are built on top of them. So when the other things don't work, we start looking for complicated reasons of why they don't work, rather than going backwards and saying, maybe that whole original assumption was rubbish. Fine example of this is Krashen's stuff. Like Krashen's idea that second language learners would learn in a similar way to first language learners. So you set second language learners up in a certain learning environment, and then they don't necessarily learn the way that you learn. You expect them to learn. So then you look at all the reasons why that might not be. On that level, instead of going backwards and saying, well, maybe I started this all wrong, and second language learners don't learn anything like the way first language learners learn. And it took applied linguistics a lot of time to get out of that, and still in modern languages, they still seem to be trapped a lot of the time in that sort of model, that they don't want to go far enough back and reimagine what the world might look like, which is essentially what they're saying that we need to do here, right, Francesca?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Sure, that's so interesting. Let me see where they. Yeah, I couldn't find where that was.
Well, I'm on 74. It says, it talks about being careful of implicit assumptions within a model.
Oh yeah,
Part is a book to spot the implicit assumptions in the worldview that suggested the model. Yeah.
Mhm.
And that is the classic problem with the Chomskyan research and the Krashen research, actually, in applied linguistics, language learning. Super interested. Super interested.
And they start talking as well about human agency in complex systems, which is one of the main oppositions that people have to this, is the idea that it's removing the idea that people have free will or that we have agency, and talking about how that's not what it's saying exactly.
You're talking about,
Starting on page 74.
yeah, right. Yeah, human agency.
I guess some people take these theories as saying that people are like machines, or that we're part of these systems, that we don't have choices in what we're doing, or that we're being controlled somehow by the system, I guess is what the opposition is, but that they're arguing against that's not what they're saying. And the way I see it is that humans are part of the system, but we are also creating the systems that we are a part of. So like with language, we're creating it and changing it over time. So we're doing that even though it's happening at a larger scale than just individual actions.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. We're back to the grain of sand and the avalanche movement. Because at the end there on page 77, they like to summarize the agency issue. We see complexity theory as allowing more of the human into the theory. However, the incorporation of human actions into systems adds significantly to the task that we've assigned to complexity theory. Yeah. Yeah, in other words, putting that in makes it that much more complicated. I mean, if you have a real hardcore Chomskyan system that actually you don't need to worry about, it's all about idealized speakers and about structures in our head, you don't actually need to worry about us at all. In fact, it's got nothing to do with us in terms of language learning, right? So you can just, I mean, one of the things that people liked was you just take the human being out of the picture. But then what happened when they tried to teach language using it, or they tried to create, not synthesized language, but, to make the system function without us, it didn't function, right? Because you needed all the things that Kiki talks about, the ontology of the world and everything else, so you couldn't actually split them up.
Yeah, because it's not, some language does not exist outside of us and not human.
Precisely.
That's what makes it exist.
And you learn to use it, and you use it within a context. A child learns to talk about distance at the same time that they're learning about distance, right? So they learn what's far away and what's near to them, and at the same time they learn the linguistic terms for what's far away and what's near to them, right? So you without that world ontology, computers can't use the patterns that they're given effectively, right? Because there's nothing, they don't know what those things actually mean.
Interesting.
So as we've sort of leaped a little bit into 4, I would like to look at the beginning of chapter 4, if that's okay, Francesca. So applied linguists need, so I'm just on the first page of chapter 4. Applied linguists theory of language, right? So theory of language, if you look at something like Chomsky theory of language, is exactly what they're describing here as structure rules and static representations, right? So that would be a classic Chomskyan system. And then what she says is, applied linguists, on the other hand, essentially concerned with processes, language development, language use, language acquisition, language learning. And none of these things, they did actually, as soon as Chomsky's theory became sort of well known, they did actually try and apply it to language teaching and language learning, not just second language teaching and language learning, but they actually put it in English language textbooks to try and teach them. It was a disaster. Because it was a good descriptive mechanism, right? Up until then, we didn't have a descriptive mechanism particularly for recursion. The thing that we talked about a few weeks ago with the language, the only language in the world, Pintuoha, that doesn't supposedly have recursion. The guys that went out into the jungle and couldn't use their computers. Awesome. Did any of you read that article, by the way? Oh, you should totally read it. We put it on Skillshare, and it is just the funniest thing. Anyway, so what you realize if you look at it from this perspective is that we were trying to apply this stable, static, fixed system to these processes that are ongoing and constantly moving, right? And needless to say, as they say here, these processes call for different theories and different methods from those associated with static grammatical description, because they are at the same time both stable and variable. So have you done the variation thing before? Who have you done that does variation theory? You guys have talked about Labov and
Talking about Labov and Bailey.
they are. Where's that, Francesca?
I think on page 87.
Oh, yep, there we go.
The different ways they looked at variation and
Yeah. So there has been recognition that variation is important, but I think it's been, I don't know what she's going to go on and say about it because I haven't pre-read this, but I think she's going to say it's probably needs to be complexified.
Yeah, they do. They say, let me see my notes real quick. We're talking about language change, variation. With Labov, with Bailey and wave theory, how they were saying that variation is short-lived, and they're talking about the S-curve, and how he was saying that variation is just something that happens and then it goes back to like a stable state.
Right.
But how Labov was saying that variation is inherent in the system, and how the complex systems view goes with the variation is inherent and always happening in the system, like the Labov's view.
Yeah.
That was
So we're actually moving on to stuff that I have got no idea about. The soft assembly and the S-curve. But what I do see they're trying to do is engage historical ways of studying language variation, which they start on page 86. There have been two dominant approaches to studying language variation in sociolinguistics. First by Labov, with weighted rules, essentially, and then second by wave theory, right. So then they say they're going to go on and talk about that in chapter 5. But it's interesting, she says, we'll have more to say about that, but let it be said for now, we believe complexity theory would find merit in both approaches and would have difficulty in both approaches as well. In other words, they were onto a good thing to recognize that there was variation, but they're not actually necessarily approaching it from the right perspective.
Right, because then they start talking about this this adiabatic principle, which apparently has to do with evolution and change is constantly happening all the time, even if we can't see it. So they use the example of Darwin's finches and how even within the lifetime of the single finch, there can be like evolution happening, whereas people usually tend to see that as something that happens over many generations that you can't see happening in real time. But there is an approach that you could see it, or you could, I guess you could observe that.
Oh, that's interesting. I actually never read the Beak of the Finch or any of that stuff. Have any of you? No.
I haven't read the book now.
No. Yeah, but what's interesting is that, so, I mean, one thing Labov and Bailey were trying to do was state that they understood that there was variation, but that somehow it had to be constrained, right? Which is what they go on to say here, that grammatical change is highly contingent. It's not completely random. So now the question is, if the wave theory or Labov's weighted variation rules don't actually work very well, what does complexity theory offer us that can, right? That can change that, yeah. Mm-hmm. So you've got the influence of linguistics on page 89. I'm sort of skipping down past UG and audiolingualism and discourse analysis, which is what I do. The major premise of this chapter is that this impulse for wholly relying on linguistic theories has not been entirely successful. Yes, I'd say that was true. I'd say indeed that was true. So they're going to move from explaining it in that way to explaining it in a different way, right? Nice. Well, what else do you have to? Do you have anything else to add, Francesca?
Well, that was about as far as I got.
Yeah, and I think this is good. I think so. Basically, I think that we've got. That was great, by the way, Francesca. Thank you so much. I think we've got as far as basically saying, in a very general view, that current linguistic theory gives us problems with explaining these processes that we have to deal with in applied linguistics, right? And that what she's going to go on to do now is talk about what those problems are and why those systems don't fulfill what we need, right? So I would say that I will tell Sal that we've got as far as 89 and that we're ready to talk about structural and structural linguistics and Chomsky linguistics and the ways in which complexity theory is trying to change that view to understanding the whole and change through the system, which is sort of, there's an interim summary on page 96 and then a continuing discussion on page 97. So I'm going to say that to Sal that we've got to page 89, the influence of linguistics. What do you think?
That sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah? Nice. I tell you, I actually enjoyed that more than I thought I would. No, there's a sort of huge division in our house between the theory person, which is Sal, and the messing around with data person, which is me. But this was actually a good one. All right. Anybody got anything to add? Has this discussion made some sort of sense? Thanks, Francesca. You did a great job on pulling out what was the important bits there to a point where I could actually follow the plot, which was awesome. So, much appreciated. Sal comes back on Tuesday. So my understanding is that he's intending to come in and do a thing on Wednesday. If that's not the case, I will get him to send a note to the group to tell you I'm officially off duty. This week was my only duty week. So I will get him to send you a note either way to tell you if he's up for doing it on Wednesday or not.
Okay.
Okay? All right. Thanks.
Sounds good. Okay.
Cheers.
All right. Bye. See you guys later.
Bye.